need to remember, though, that it's, at this point, it's also collecting a lot of private information, data collection on people all over the place. All right, now, with that said, I'll pick up where I did last time regarding the book that I did, the latest one. It's offered by Radio Liberty, called The Power Elite, Their History and Future. And it's the latest one. Before that was The Power Elite and the Secret Nazi Plan. But where we left off was, in this book, I have a chapter called The Power Elite and the Muslim Brotherhood. And I was trying to point out how the Muslim Brotherhood didn't just pop up out of nowhere. As a background, I had mentioned that Lord Herbert Samuel, he was one of the first people who I had found to use that term, New World Order, like I was discussing a minute ago with Chuck Hagel and Joe Biden. And he used that, Herbert Samuel, in the House of Lords over in England, May 16th and August 7th of 1918. And he was part of the Milner Group. The Milner Group, Lord Alfred Milner is the one who was carrying out Cecil Rhodes's wishes beginning in the early 1900s. And they controlled British foreign policy from that time, 1901-02, right on up to about 1939. At the beginning of the Second World War.
And I think it's so vitally important, Dennis, that people understand that suddenly it was this group, this Milner group, call it what you will, that established the Muslim Brotherhood. They wanted an enemy. They knew that down the line they could utilize that to play. Suddenly, people over there in the Muslim world against them, us, and basically then to justify expanding the power of surveillance over our lives to protect us from those wicked Muslims that they have been financing going all the way back to 1928. And the fact you never hear this reflects the degree of control that exists of what we think and believe.
While the storm clouds gather
Well, Dr. Cuddy, you go right ahead and pick the story up because I think it's so vitally important.
Okay, so Herbert Samuel used those terms. Then, as a member of the Milner Group that controlled foreign policy, Samuel, in 1921, 3 years after he made those two New World Order statements, he was the one who appointed the Hajj Amin al-Husseini, appointed him as a mufti. He was a title, sort of a religious title, and head political administrator of Arab Palestine. Now, Milner, who was more or less in charge of all of these people, they used to call them like Milner's kindergarten. He used this term because they were younger fellows that Milner was bringing along. He was the one, Milner, in charge of executing Cecil Rhodes' plan to, as Rhodes said, take the government of the whole world. And 2 years after Herbert Samuel appointed al-Husseini as the mufti there and head administrator, 2 years later, Milner himself, in the House of Lords on June 27, 1923, said regarding Palestine that there, quote, must always remain not an Arab country or a Jewish country, but an international country in which all the world has a special interest. And then he said, I think some, quote, some capital letter, mandatory, capital M, and capital P, power. So he didn't just say, I think some mandatory power will always be required. He uses a capital M for mandatory and capital P for power. That means like an executing entity. Like at that time you would say a League of Nations or later the UN or, whatever. But he definitely has in mind this sort of world body that's going to run things. And while al-Husseini, who was appointed by Samuel, was in Palestine, and while he was there in the 20s, a fellow named Hassan al-Banna, B-A-N-N-A, Hassan al-Banna, he founded the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt in 1928. And it's really been from that organization that your radical Islamic groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad and Al-Qaeda have come. They've come there. And this is just, I'm sort of connecting dots and speculating. I try in my book to give sources which even sort of leftist skeptics would recognize. So in this case, what I just did is Mark Hosenball and Michael Isikoff of Newsweek have reported a number of times the connections between Al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood members, like he gives the specific names, Mamun, Darqal-Zanli, and Yusuf Nada, for example. Those two, there's definite connections. So you can draw a direct line from the Brotherhood to Al-Qaeda And, I mean, they're not identical. They're not identical, but they're connections. They sort of work together from time to time. And also, former CIA agent, he's about 25 years over there in the Middle East. His name's Robert Baer. He wrote a couple of books, and in the one called Sleeping with the Devil, he explained how the U.S., quote, made common cause with the Muslim Brothers and used them to do our dirty work in Yemen, Afghanistan, and plenty of other places, end quote. So it's not like we're sort of over here separate. Maybe Barack Obama recently sort of, when he became president, liked them and wanted to allow them a seat at the table when he made his first speech over there because Hosni Mubarak had oppressed them. You know, it's not like this is some group we just didn't know about, and Barack Obama was just sort of introducing himself. No. According to Robert Baer, who's over there for 25 years, this is what he said. I'll say it again. Made common cause.
Hold that thought. We'll be right back in just a moment. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and Dr. Cuddy is certainly talking about Robert Baer. Now, I've actually interviewed Robert Baer on several occasions. I certainly presented his books, and Robert Baer certainly worked certainly with our intelligence agencies over in the Middle East for many years, and he quite openly says in his books, Robert Baer, that we're financing this whole radical Islamic movement. There are all sorts of branches. There's Al-Qaeda, there's the Taliban, there's all sorts of subdivisions for it, the Muslim Brotherhood. But where do you think the money comes from? You don't have a movement without money. The money comes certainly in one means or another from our intelligence agencies working in concert with the people over in Great Britain. There's a little concert of people who really want an enemy so that they can justify, we've got to have more surveillance of the American people to protect them from those wicked terrorists that want to take away their freedom. Ladies and gentlemen, how many major terrorist attacks have we had in the United States going back to September 11th? And it was a very, very serious question as to what really happened on that day, especially when you get into the background of suddenly the fact that one of the passports from one of the hijackers who hijacked one of the planes just happened to survive suddenly the 9/11 attack. And there's example after example after example. If you haven't heard or certainly listened to our 4 CD sets on 9/11, you need to get them to realize this whole thing was as phony as a $3 bill, but they needed an excuse to get us into this confrontation with these wicked Islamists who were financing. Go right ahead. Just exactly as during the Second World War, we financed the Nazis because we had to have an enemy. And if you doubt that, you need to get John Loftus's material, the DVD. These 4 CDs set, The War Against the Jews in his book, America's Nazi Secret. We financed the Nazis, the best enemy money could buy. Go right ahead, Dennis.
Yeah, and so the impression that the media gives to people is Hosni Mubarak was a dictator, and he had put down the Muslim Brotherhoods, and they were illegal. And here comes Barack Obama in 2009, and he's delivering a speech over there, and he wants 10 members of the Brotherhood included, and he's going to open the door to them and have a dialogue, and they'll be able to participate in their government. This is all something very, very new. The impression you get is that this is a new opening to this group, the Muslim Brotherhood, beginning with Barack Obama. But as Robert Baer said in his book Sleeping with the Devil, which is some years ago, he said the U.S., quote, made common cause with the Muslim Brothers. This is years ago, and used them, quote, to do our dirty work in Yemen, Afghanistan, and plenty of other places. In other words, this isn't something new. This isn't something Barack Obama discovered and opened the door to. For years, for decades, we used the Brotherhood to do our dirty work. You know, if we want something nasty done, instead of our troops or agents or, special military strikes were to occur, whatever it is, in Yemen, Afghanistan, other places, we would use the brothers to do that. Now, how do you do that? Like Dr. Stan says, money. You basically pay them, okay, here's the money, go do something nasty in those countries for us. And the brothers would do it. And so that gives you an idea what they're doing. And in fact, Gamal Abdel Nasser, back in the 50s, rounded up some of the leadership, and even then he found out that the Muslim Brotherhood had been infiltrated by U.S. and Soviet, British, and so forth intelligence far back, just far back. There had been this connection. And now in the 30s, of course, 1930s, the Brotherhood supported Adolf Hitler. It distributed Mein Kampf, his most notable book, Hitler's most notable book, and by 1936, only 800 members were members of the Brotherhood back then. It wasn't a very large group in 36. There were only 800 members. They began to oppose the British rule, supposedly, in Egypt. And 2 years later, by 1938, the Brotherhood membership had grown to 2,000. 200,000. So it had made a tremendous jump in just a couple of years. And by the late 1940s, it had grown to at least 500,000. So it quickly gained a lot of strength, even back then. And in 1933, when Hitler came to power in Germany, he was around, but he didn't actually, after the Reichstag fire that he blamed on the communists, which was really not the communists who did that, but it was, something good for him to rally the people against. Like Dr. Stan says, you need an enemy, right? So you have a fire, you bring it on the Soviets, it's the communists. So we, the Nazis, have to rally around Adolf and, do something about this. So when Hitler came to power in Germany, there was a group called Young Egypt, or is otherwise known as the Green Shirts. They were founded on October of that year, 1933, by Ahmed Hussein, who had been greatly influenced by al-Husseini, who I mentioned earlier. And Young Egypt...
I want you to hold that thought. We're going to be back in just a moment with Dr. Dennis Cuddy. And these are the things you're never going to get from the New York Times or the Washington Post. Dr. Cuddy, you go right ahead.
Okay, well, this group, Young Egypt, otherwise known as the Green Shirts, because that's what they wore, they were founded in that same year. Adolf Hitler came to power, 1933. This group was founded in October by Ahmed Hussein. And he had been, of course, greatly influenced by al-Husseini. Remember who Herbert Samuels appointed Mufti and head political administrator for Arab Palestine. Well, Young Egypt quickly announced its support of Hitler and the Nazis, and one of its early members was Anwar Sadat, who you would hear a lot about many years later in the 70s. So Anwar Sadat is a young fellow. He's a member of Young Egypt, and Sadat helped the Nazis during World War II. And you might say, oh, well, maybe he didn't know what they were up to. Well, by the end of the war, World War II, surely he and everybody else knew what the Nazis were up to. So what did he do 8 years after the war? In a September 18, 1953 letter to the Egyptian news daily that was titled Al-Musawahar, he expressed his admiration for Hitler. So this is 8 years after everybody knows what Hitler did. Here he is, Anwar Sadat, expressing his admiration for Hitler and all all that he had done. Now, during World War II, President Roosevelt, everybody, I'm rather surprised that there wasn't more opposition to that statue being built of Roosevelt, because he did a number of nasty things that I've mentioned before. But during World War II, for example, Roosevelt showed that he was no real friend of the Jews, because in Secretary of State Edward Stettinius's papers, Stettinius wrote that during FDR's meeting with Stalin at Yalta, that would be in February of 1945, Stalin asked FDR if FDR intended to make any concessions to King Saud of Saudi Arabia. And then Stettinius wrote this, quote, the president, FDR, replied that there was only one concession he thought he might offer, and that was to give him the 6 million Jews in the United States. Now, think about that. People know about the Holocaust, the 6 million figures, and so forth. And so here's Roosevelt. I suppose he thought he was making a joke.
Hold that thought. We'll be back in just a moment here.